Democritus, 460 to 370 BC. Democritus is the last figure we shall consider among the Pre-Platonic philosophers. He was born a year before Socrates, so he cannot even rightly be called a pre-Socratic. He is more like a Socratic contemporary. He is the figure that completes the pluralist project in some sense, and that his philosophy puts forward an atomistic worldview. In Democritus, we find a view of the world governed by necessity rather than miracles. In this way, Democritus fulfills the long project of the natural philosophers up to this point. Democritus was either from Abdera or Miletus. He was known for having traveled widely. According to Clement of Alexandria, Democritus visited Babylon, Persia, and Egypt. He learned from the priests and the magi, and sought out the most famous religious figures and intellectuals of his time in order to study under them. Democritus says, quote, "I am the most widely traveled man of all my contemporaries, and have pursued inquiries in the most distant places. I have visited more countries and climes than anyone else, and have listened to the teachings of more learned men. No one has surpassed me in the drawing of lines accompanied by demonstrations, not even the rope knotters of Egypt, with whom I passed 5 years on foreign soil." End quote. Nothing much is known of his life other than a mass of fables, as Nietzsche calls it. He may have studied under Empedocles. Other stories say that he learned from a Pythagorean. Many of us are familiar with the commonly ascribed character trait that Democritus was the philosopher who laughed. He's often compared or contrasted against Heraclitus, the philosopher who wept. As Nietzsche argues in his lecture, this association is of a much later origin and there's no basis for it. The philosophy of Democritus only exists in fragments and in the writing of others. Nietzsche argues that the Eleatics, led by Parmenides, derive their chief significance to us from the fact that Democritus attacks their central idea. Understanding Parmenides is important, most of all, because it helps us understand Democritus. Democritus works more or less in reverse from Parmenides. That is to say, he starts from an opposite axiom and affirms everything the Eleatics attempted to deny. Democritus begins from the reality of motion, rather than from the reality of quote-unquote being. Motion is readily observable. It is a phenomenon that we all have experience with, and it obtains in reality as we know it. If we begin by acknowledging this fact, the empirical reality of motion, then the metaphysical problems surrounding motion will very quickly appear to us not as problems with motion, but as problems with metaphysics. Even though this may be a rather obvious point to stress, Democritus argues, motion is real. This is the kind of attitude of Democritus that's perhaps as important as any other aspect of his thought, beginning from the affirmation of empirical reality, what is given to us by the senses, making our metaphysics answerable to that empirical reality instead of denying the reality of the senses in lieu of some search for abstract logical certainty. On account of this approach of Democritus, it might be easy to see why it was that figures such as Plato, who denied the senses, hated Democritus. Plato attempted to destroy every copy of Democritus's works that he could get his hands on. The Democritean attack against Parmenidean being presses a more fundamental point, however. It is really prior even to our empirical observation of external reality, the kind of objection that Democritus raises. Democritus sees the refutation of Parmenides simply by affirming mind as our direct experience. Nietzsche puts it this way, quote, "There exists a motion, since I think, and thought has reality," end quote. So not "I think, therefore I am," but "I think, therefore there is motion." The argument will go like this. Thought is moving. People begin from one thought, one idea about the world. For example, someone like, say, Parmenides I, who starts from an Anaximandrian perspective. And then people change their understanding. They move on to a new perspective about the world, such as the perspective of the pure theory of being put forward by Parmenides too. Parmenides' thought moved. Even he would be forced to admit this. He changed from thinking about reality one way, having one thought about reality, to having another thought about reality, and one that Parmenides considered to be the only correct idea about reality. He believed he had moved from thinking about the world falsely to thinking about it accurately. He had moved from false thought to true thought. If Parmenides is to deny the motion of his own thought, saying that thought is just as much of an illusion as the senses are, well, he's just called his pure theory of being an illusion. He said that thought was the only thing we should follow, not the senses. But the thought that only being is also an illusion. Parmenides' certainties can therefore be dispensed with, because they cannot survive such a position. With this, the Parmenidean rejection of non-being is abolished by Democritus, who affirms non-being exists. Quote, with absolutely filled space, a plenum, motion is impossible. End quote. So if being is to indicate bodies in extended space, there must be emptiness between these bodies if they are to move and interact. As such, non-being is required for motion, and because motion is undoubtedly real, non-being must be regarded as just as real as being. Quote, motion demonstrates being as much as not being. If not being were to exist alone, there would be no motion. End quote. Democritus also continues along the Anaxagorian path, in which matter is said to consist of different existence, different beings. But nevertheless, these are all unified, they are homogeneous, insofar as these existences are all material, they are all matter. They are the same in that they can affect one another as matter. Democritus takes this argument a step further, however, and conceives of the smallest possible unit of matter, positing that these units of matter would be indestructible, non-interpenetrating, and extended bodies. He called these smallest possible bodies atoms, and said that all matter was made up of their aggregation. Democritus argues that things come into being when the atoms coalesce together into a more complex form, they aggregate, and things pass away when the atoms disaggregate, when they dissolve. While Democritus affirms not being, or non-being, what he calls the void, or the space between matter, the void itself does not become being. Neither does being become the void. Material transformations occur, but the material does not actually arise or pass away. The atoms themselves are forever enduring, and the physical world is eternally existent. Perhaps the clumsiest aspect of the Democritean atomism is that Democritus posited the notion of atoms of spirit, or atoms of soul. He argued that all material atoms were suffused with such atoms of spirit. Material atoms could be modified, they could be made smoother, finer, spherical by the mechanical processes of the world, and the finest such atoms were atoms of fire. Democritus argues that these atoms have the greatest speed and ease of movement. It is these such fiery atoms that make up spirit. Spirit is therefore a modification of matter. This is the explanation for animate things, such as living beings, and this idea flows from the initial axiom that thought partakes of motion. Thought is the most freely moving aspect of existence. Nietzsche writes, quote, these fiery particles extend throughout the entire body. A spirited atom, seelen atom, is inserted between every two physical atoms. They are in continual motion. End quote. This aspect of Democritus' theory was criticized by Aristotle, and it's clear that Nietzsche has his own reservations about it. Perhaps the most charitable understanding of the spirited atom is found when we consider the goal of Democritus: to make consciousness a modification of matter, rather than setting up consciousness as a metaphysical principle which is prior to matter. Nietzsche thus had high praise for the Democritean philosophy. He wrote, quote, of all the more ancient systems, the Democritean is of the greatest consequence. The most rigorous necessity is presupposed in all things. There are no sudden or strange violations of nature's course. Now, for the first time, the collective, anthropomorphic, mythic view of the world has been overcome. Now, for the first time, do we have a rigorous, scientific, useful hypothesis. As such, materialism has always been of the greatest utility. It is the most down-to-earth point of view. It proceeds from real properties of matter, and it does not indifferently leave out the simplest forces, as is done by accounts of mind, or that of final ends by Aristotle. It is a grand idea. This entire world of order and purposiveness, of countless qualities to be traced back to externalizations of one force of the most basic sort. Matter, moving itself according to general laws, produces a blind mechanistic result which appears to be the outline of a highest wisdom." End quote. And so, while Nietzsche said that the Eleatic view of the world is the least consequential, the worldview of Democritus is of the most consequence. It is the most useful for us modern thinkers to consider. His principle of movement can be seen as a sort of inchoate notion of something like gravitation. Democritus argues that as atoms coagulate and dissolve, heavier aggregations sink and lighter ones rise. Democritus follows the thought of Anaxagoras insofar as these multiple aggregations strike and collide with one another, and this strife is what produces transformations and changes in the physical world. But rather than nous, or love, Democritus suggests that the underlying principle is chance. Nietzsche takes issue with this kind of language, but he reinterprets Democritus in terms which will look familiar to anyone who has read Nietzsche's own philosophy. Quote, "The world is moved and arises out of, quote, chance, accidental colliding, concurso quodam fortuito. Blind chance rules among materialists. This is an entirely unphilosophical manner of speaking. We should instead call it purposeless causality, necessity without purposive intentions. Precisely here is there no chance whatsoever, but rather the most rigorous lawfulness, only not according to laws of reason. Well then, Democritus derives all motion from empty space and weight. Heavy atoms sink down and drive the smaller ones upward by pressure. The most primal motion of all, of course, is vertical, a steady, eternal fall into the infinity of space. Speed cannot be ascribed to them, since, given the infinity of space and the absolute steadiness of the fall, no relative standard for it exists at all." End quote. So whether one uses the term chance or necessity or non-purposive causality, what is significant for Nietzsche is the lack of intentions in the operative forces, the lack of teleology. Nietzsche's understanding of materialism is clarified here. A material understanding of reality, a true material understanding, has to be non-teleological. The world is not made for any goal or purpose, but acts according to patterns or processes, which are a form of necessity. Democritus is the final step in this direction of bringing forth this materialist worldview, and this fact is made clear insofar as his worldview is totally liberated from such teleological thinking. This is the final great leap of the Pre-Platonics, the leap from teleology, some reason or purpose for existence, to an existence which simply is and has no such purpose. Such a teleology was involved in every single explanation of reality up to that point, with the possible exception of Heraclitus, but Heraclitus, in his appeal to play, seems to lapse wholeheartedly into that idea of it's just random chance, whereas Nietzsche stresses this is anything but random. From the cosmogonies of the Orphics to the myths of the Olympians to the philosophy of Anaximander to the religious vision of Empedocles, there's always been this kind of telos, but not so with Democritus. And in some sense, we could say that in the course of this dialogue, the Pre-Platonics have discovered many of the major questions of epistemology. In Democritus, we see epistemology formulated as a discipline for the first time. Of particular interest to us will be Democritus's stance, his attempt at explaining why it is that we don't have direct sensation of these atoms, but without arguing that the truth of the senses is an illusion of some kind. Democritus does this by making a logical distinction between what he calls primary and secondary characteristics. Democritus and his school of atomists suggested that the qualities that past philosophers had taken to be objective aspects of reality were only qualities in our sensation of the objects. Things like heat and cold and dampness and brightness and so on. For Democritus, the independent characteristics of the object in itself, so to speak, were its primary characteristics, such as the qualities of the object's atoms, the things that make it up, the matter. The atoms that make up the object are eternal, indivisible, extended, corpuscular, non-interpenetrating, and so on. These are the primary characteristics. The secondary characteristics are the qualities, things such as moist, dry, hot, cold, solid, liquid, and so on. These are all relative. They're represented to the conscious mind according to its own powers of conception. Reality is not directly experienced by the conscious mind, but only reality's image, shaped by the one perceiving it. This is another huge leap of Democritus, and that all of these qualities had always been assumed to have some essential nature or existence. They had all been variously used as a driving force of nature, such as Anaximander sourcing the creation of existent phenomena to the interaction between warmth and cold. But here, warmth and cold are understood as sensations, something which we perceive with our nervous system. They are therefore relative, not something absolute or essential to the object, but indicative of our experience of it and no more than that. Nietzsche writes, quote, "We have here the distinction that returns with the English philosopher John Locke. Primary characteristics, which the thing in itself receives apart from our representations, such that we cannot think of it separated from extension, impenetrability, shape, and number. Everything else is secondary, the product of these primary characteristics' operations on the organs of sensation. The mere sensation of these, followed by color, sound, taste, smell, solidity, smoothness, flatness, roughness, and so on. The creativity of things is also what accounts for the action of the nerves of the sense organs." End quote. Democritus says that like is only sensed by like. What he means by this is that our sense organs were developed in accordance with the strength of the corresponding sense impression that they're designed to sense. Our experience of the world is a representation because we don't perceive the object directly. Rather, quote, "visible things emit effluences that bear their shapes, and the eye reflects them," end quote. In other words, visual things leave a sort of mark, an image that's carried on the air around them. The object itself never touches the eye, only the air that carries its image. Quote, "What touches this itself, the eye, is only the air that moves from these images and is made into an impression of them," end quote. And therefore, the representation of the object is a creation just as much of our visual sense organ, the thing that is alike to these visual effluences, and the eye then produces its own effluences that, quote, "modify the image," end quote. So with Democritus, we're faced with a philosopher whose importance to Nietzsche's thought really can't be understated, even though Nietzsche almost never mentions him in his published work. Democritus influences Nietzsche on several key points. First, that mind is a modification of matter. Second, that there is no immaculate perception of the objective world, that all perception is perspectival because we're only perceiving the secondary qualities. And finally, that there is no teleology to the world. The world acts according to non-purposive forces. All of this is reflected in the thought of Nietzsche. Democritus and his atomistic school stand apart from the rest of the Greek world when we consider the sheer sobriety and clear-headedness of their doctrine. It is the materialist worldview that is, in Nietzsche's words, quote, "precisely our world, in whose production we are constantly engaged," end quote. How then are we to attempt to sum up these pre-Platonics, these philosophers of the tragic age of the Greeks, who dared to philosophize in spite of all of its dangers? if they are to be understood as physicians to the Greek culture, as those who fostered the health of a culture by cultivating the power of reason to render an image of the world, how are we to explain what comes after these pre-Platonics? That is to say, Socrates, Plato, the moralistic, theoretical, anti-life view of the world, as Nietzsche classifies it. The view that denies the senses, that lives in idealism, that seeks to bring forth utopias, condemns everything irrational and artistic according to the standards of its reason. Nietzsche saw Socrates and Plato as, if anything, anti-Greek, and we cannot deny they are the next step in this process. Perhaps these kinds of troubling questions might have been one factor that pushed Nietzsche not to finish this essay, since it is difficult to say what conclusion we ought to draw about pre-Platonic philosophy here at its ending, brilliant and important though Democritus was. What came forth after him was the good, the theory of the forms, the moralistic interpretation of the world as supreme. Well, if I was to speculate about what Nietzsche would have written about this had he concluded his essay, we might begin by pointing out the antipathy of Plato toward Democritus. We might also consider the ways in which the pre-Platonics have been generally dismissed or treated as, at best, a mere prelude to Socrates, when in fact Socrates and Plato seemingly turned the spirit of the pre-Platonics on its head. The significance of the pre-Platonic philosophy might be recognized in the difference between the artful, leaping style of these single-minded sages and the style of Plato, the slow, ponderous, systematizing style. And if we are to admit that Parmenides anticipated the coming of Plato, it should only be with the caveat that Plato borrowed from him, pilfered from him, worked his ideas into a broader system which ultimately rejected Parmenides' entire project. Perhaps another observation might be that the symptoms manifest in Greek philosophy mirror the physiological reality of Greece's decline, that the tendencies in Greek philosophy that eventually blossom into Platonism are tendencies that existed in Greek society already, as a consequence of what we would call decline or decadence. These symptoms emerge in philosophy because they are symptoms, not causes. Seen from that angle, the history of pre-Platonic thought appears as the transition from what Nietzsche called the tragic to the period he called the theoretic. This roughly corresponds with the ascension of Macedon over the Greek world and the rise of Alexandrian Greece. After Alexander, the Greek intellectual world became less creative in Nietzsche's view. It became more concerned with cataloging and categorizing what had come before. Many of its great figures were scientists, historians, authors of encyclopedias. Its dramatic forms were very meta, so to speak, making references and allusions to the great works that were written centuries beforehand. In other words, at the end of the Greek world's life, its thought and its art became derivative. Its focus came to be system building, arranging, ranking, organizing. And so, if we return to Nietzsche's remarks at the beginning of Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, he says that while the Greeks began philosophizing at the right time, they certainly did not know when to stop. They didn't end at the right time. Their philosophy ventured headlong into the clouds of abstraction and separated entirely from the natural world, and this was the greatest sign of their decline. The philosophers who existed before that time, before the time of abstraction and systematization, offer us a window into a creative philosophy. And that's Nietzsche's main emphasis throughout the text, that each of these figures had to create philosophy for himself. It didn't exist as an established discipline with established schools, and even at the tail end of this period, when something approximating those things had come into being, the most remarkable figures are these men who appear with a single-minded tyrannical thought about reality, an artistic thought about reality. They are self-legislators. They create the world out of their own reason and dare to put themselves into contradiction with the pre-established explanations. These cosmogonies, which were naive and allegorical and mythological and taken for granted. They see fit to attack these pre-established viewpoints, much like Nietzsche's lion in his parable of the camel, lion, and child, so that they can remake the world anew and become the creative child. The thinkers of the Alexandrian world, by contrast, are more like camels. They pick up all of these previous ideas and carry them off on their backs. Perhaps then we could see these philosophers of the tragic age as an inspiration to Nietzsche, first and foremost, because of their common act of world authoring. If there is one descriptor that seems to be applied to these men of such diverse character and background, pride is perhaps the most common term that Nietzsche uses. Each of them obtains their pride in a different way, expresses their pride in a different way, understands their pride in a different way, but all have the underlying faith and their own reason that allows them to say that what is commonly said and believed is ignorant and false. Let me present you with another truth, another world which has been entirely derived from my own wisdom. Let me entice you and invite you to live in my new world. Arguably, Nietzsche does this with his world as will to power. It is another image of the natural world as ruled by the most rigorous necessity, but one which is absent of any teleology. It's a world which Nietzsche fashions out of his own wisdom in opposition to the ignorance of the great many, a world which he shows to us out of his own mirror, his own self-legislation, and remaking of reality. In that way, his entire philosophy carries on the tradition of those tragic philosophers, who were for Nietzsche an enduring source of fascination. Thank you for joining me, everyone. I hope you've had as much fun as I have on this journey through the thought of these single-minded sages, as Nietzsche calls them. Let me know in the comments which pre-Platonic or pre-Socratic or whatever you want to call them is your favorite. It's hard for me not to say Heraclitus, but for my part, I really like Anaxagoras and even Empedocles, in spite of how differently I think from Empedocles, because he's just such an unusual figure, and the descriptions of him and his cult of followers just make him a bit larger than life. I like that it's not easy to categorize him also. So those are two of my favorites, aside from Heraclitus, which is the obvious answer. But again, let me know who your favorites are. That's all for this week, everyone. See you next time. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimelyreflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.